the sun come out and brought the wind with it. It's kind of nippy out there right now. At least it is for me. I've spent so much time tropical that my blood is thin and I get cold easily. Yeah, ooh. Okay, 314. And this is somebody's favorite song that's not even here yet. I might have to sing it twice, or we can stand here and when he comes in, we can all turn around and look at him. I don't know. Shackled by a heavy burden, 'neath a load of guilt and shame, then the hand of Jesus touched me, and now I am no longer the same. He touched me, oh, he touched me, and oh, the joy that floods my soul. Something happened, and now I know he touched me and made me whole. Since I met this blessed Savior, since he cleansed and made me whole, I will never cease to praise him. I'll shout it while eternity rolls. He touched me, oh, he touched me, and oh, the joy that floods my soul. Something happened, and now I know he touched me and made me whole. Cross the page. 1 and 4. 313. Cross the page. First and last. Years I spent in vanity and pride, caring not my Lord was crucified, knowing not it was for me he died on Calvary. Mercy there was great and grace was free. Pardon there was multiplied to me. There my burdensome found liberty at Calvary. Oh, the love that drew salvation's plan. Oh, the grace that brought it down to man. Oh, the mighty gulf that God did. Thank you. Mercy there was great and grace was free. Pardon there was multiplied to me. There my burdened soul found liberty at Calvary. Next.
Good evening. Enjoying this beautiful sunshine. And I got bad news for you. The ragweed won't calm down till it frosts. So that's why everybody's coughing and snorting and carrying on. The ragweed's still enjoying us. Okay. Everybody have their paper so we can look at their prayer list. Okay, we have at St. Jude's is Levi Hillibus. The VA is George Williams. Duke is Amy Emmert. IN is, what's that, Indiana, I guess, the Drew True Love. And Abington is Cheryl Guthrie, and JCMC is Shirley Allman. That's a bunch of folks. Um, who's that? Oh, okay, Frank. Well, how many brothers do you have? Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Are you the baby? No. Okay. The only girl, though. Okay.
That's Shirley Allman, that's at the Med Center. That's Anna Ellis's mother, and she had a stroke. John had sent me that, so I don't know if Shirley's home now. I'm not sure the status of where she is.
Okay. All right. Any additional updates on those folks? Okay, that's a bunch in the hospital. Starts about this time of year. Okay, special request, search for the youth minister. Gail Siebelbeller, and Alyssa Murden, the Philippines, our nation, and Brittany Egan. Any updates on these folks? Did the Philippines survive another typhoon or earthquake or what?
They found a lot more bodies than the earthquake after they did that with officers to the houses that were made out of concrete post and beam type construction. They crumbled, and so the net oil went up over 80. And I don't know anything about the floods, except some of the citizens are suing. They want to know where the money went for flood control that never happened. Kind of sounds familiar.
Sounds like New
Kind
Orleans.
of sounds familiar. Where'd the money go?
Yeah,
And you know all about our nation.
yeah, our nation,
I
yes.
don't need to expound on that.
No, we don't need, we know that a lot of the problems going on there. Okay, any update on the other folks?
Brittany Egan is Maddie's instructor at school,
That's cool.
and she's having surgery on her rotator cuff Monday.
Okay, shoulder surgery. That's the only trouble. Sometimes you wear that stuff out. Expected moms, Olivia Williams. Any additions or updates on that? The nursing home, Sycamore Springs, Bill Roberts, Jan McGuire. Life Care, Helen Hyatt. Hermitage, Betty Jo Montgomery, Raymond Crabtree, Randall Vines. Signature, Barbara Hicks, Tammy Wells, Teresa Campbell, Sarah Banner, Daisy Grindstaff. Mountain City, Jim Buchanan, Kyle Bradley, Mike Dellinger, Ivy Hall, Opal Baird, Brenda Stout, Shirley Irick, Buck Gentry. The Waters, Evelyn Collins, Margaret Crow, Ted and Betty Tipton. Any updates on those folks?
We can move Teresa Campbell to the home list.
Okay,
She's not at the home any longer, but she needs a lot of credit.
okay. Teresa Campbell, did you get that? Home list.
Yes. And my mother, Sarah Banner, she's doing good.
Okay. Any other additions? Okay. Out of the area, the Barons, Amy for Africa, DeSumas, Dakota Williams, Tina Hicks, Jerry McNeil, Ashley Lippard, Jamie Vines, Tammy Howard, Patricia Palo, Eden Palo, Caudill, Mark and Carol Stout, Elias West, who's a missionary in Ukraine. Any updates on these folks?
We can give Jerry McNeil off. He's back home now,
Okay.
on vacation.
Any other updates? Okay, home, Travis Oliver, Kenny Williams, Harold Porteous, Bernadetta, Andrews, Emma Jean Kay, Jean Carroll, Bonnie Crabtree, Ann Richenberg, Kim Miller, Mac Hicks, Don Pritchard, Roger Norris, Ruby Odom, Joe Holt, Brenda Stewart, Paul Peer, Curtis Morton, Sean Elliott, Retha Williams, Gene and Craig Schaefer, Eugene and Debbie Davis, Carl Lee Hazelwood, Gene Blevins. Any updates on those folks?
Brenda Stewart is Todd Montgomery's mom, and that's why he and Tracy don't be here the last couple of weeks. They're having to take care of her. She's back home now. She was in a nursing home, but she's at home now, so they're having to take care of her.
All right,
We heard from Carl Lee. He's healed.
well, when I saw him last time, he said he was having a little less pain. He comes and goes, he was having a little less. But now that was last week. Sympathy, Louisville Street family, Greg Norris family, and the Wanda Laws family. Now you have updates on those? Okay. Okay, now we were going to feed some of them.
The Wanda Laws family, yeah, we're feeding them Saturday. I think her arrangements are, visiting Saturday from 12 to 2, and funeral at 2, and then the burial's right after that.
Okay. Praises and Thanksgiving. Praises, we're here today. Thankful for another beautiful day. Even though we got a little bit of rain, but we needed more. I would have taken it. I got Mona's storm door put up after a long, trying, difficult time. She wanted the storm door put up. Easy install. Yeah. Yeah. It'd been better if the door opener had been a little bit straighter, would have helped.
Just building a new house around the door.
Yeah. That's how that went, but I did not throw it out in the yard. I almost did. All right.
I'm just thankful for my son, our son. He's just such a good person, and he stepped up to a call on that son, I don't know what this is, that he didn't have to do. And he was very generous, and may not make it easy, but he did.
I was thankful for the service Sunday night. I thought it was just really, really good.
Went well.
That's what heaven's gonna be like. Worshiping with people that, we don't go to church with, but who love Jesus.
Yeah, that is the common denominator, isn't it? Yeah, that was good. It was a good service, and the way it was handled was good. It was the comments and everything was made, so it was a good service. I'd like to see a few more folks here, but that's the way that works. Yeah. Well, tonight we need to have a prayer first. Any other special, before we get into the prayer, any other special requests or anything I need to mention? Anything going on in the community I don't know that we don't have on here? Anything happening? I think we should be thankful the high school, it looks like they're doing something over there. There's stuff happening, so that's good. You can go by there and see that. The county's still recovering, of course. We talked about that Sunday night. Anything else going on we need to especially pray about tonight? We know our nation excitement here, all kinds of stuff going on there, which was been predicted, I think, somewhere in some book talked about some of these things. That's happening. Okay. All right. Floyd, would you open us up in prayer, please?
Heavenly Father, once again, Lord, we come into your house to lift up some names to you, Father, and you don't know each one by name, and you don't know the reason they're on this list, Father. We're just so thankful that you are there, and that you are ever knowing and ever present in every way. But Lord, we ask that you minister to each need of each person that brings forward.
Thank you. Well, tonight, I hope to make this as interesting as I can, but this is, it's a broad history of the Jewish race, their nation, the thing that's happened in the past. And part of it brought on because of that John was talking about the different prophets, and we have all those prophets in there and when they showed up and what they did and the times are involved. The Bible is the Old Testament. I want to talk about the Old Testament for a moment. The Old Testament is historically pretty accurate, and it brings in the nation that we know as the Jewish nation and what he did with them and how all these things happen. But we sometimes forget when we read the Bible, we look at these things, we study these things, that things are repeated in different places. For instance, if you go to Kings and you go to Judges and you go to Deuteronomy and then you jump over to Numbers and then you go over to Solomon, all these things are tied together. And so we tend to compress a lot of this information. And the way the Bible is written, that Old Testament is written, is historically accurate, but it almost assumes that you know what they're talking about in that time period. And for instance, this nation is relatively young. This is a young country. But we're looking back through history, and as we can look all the way back to the period of time of building the pyramids. The first pyramids was around 2650 BC. So over 2,000 years before Christ was born, and then here we are in 2025. So that's a broad section of history, and we have pretty accurate information about everything that's occurred since the birth of Christ, because the written word, the things have been studied and written, but we still have all these periods of time when you have these empires that have come up and gone down. And here in our short period of time, I was born in 1949, which was after 2 world wars in the last century. And then we had the Korean conflict during my lifetime. We had the Vietnam War during my lifetime. We've had the Middle Eastern wars during my lifetime. And we've had all these things that have happened. And today we have wars that are going on. And these are short periods of times of several years that they occurred, like the most recent thing to celebrate the 2nd anniversary of the invasion of Hamas into Israel and the devastation that occurred. And so we have these little blocks of time. So when you're looking at the Bible, you look back into the Old Testament, they've compressed 2,000 years of history into the book that thick. So, the Bible has been, it's full of myths, and it's full of things that are to help you learn to how to behave, and it's full of this and it's full of that. Well, you've compressed 2,000 years of history into a short period of time, and it's the history basically of the Jewish people, and it's surprisingly accurate. I'll give you an example. Until probably the late 1960s, early 1970s, it was said that the Hittite Empire, the Hittite people, didn't exist. It was all made up in the Bible. And then suddenly they found them. They found Hittite things that were described in the Bible, where they were, what they were doing. This was the early Bronze Age. So it discovered the Hittites, and Hittites had a huge empire, probably about, we think most likely around 1300 BC, something like that. And where they were was for present-day Turkey, Asia Minor. So that entire area that the Old Testament is written in, the geography is really important. So I want to dive into that for a couple of minutes, and then we'll go on into a few other things. I'm going to kind of start with Abraham. Imagine that. He lived initially, the city he lived in was down next to the ocean where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers came into the sea. And he traveled from there up along that way around the northern part, all the way up into present-day Persia, and came back down through Palestine, all the way down to Egypt. And he ended up in Egypt, and Joseph was there. In his period of time that he was there, the death of Joseph was roughly 1806 BC, 1800 years before Christ. And so Joseph was in Israel at that time. In Egypt at that time. So you have this period of time that was during Abraham, from roughly 2092 to 1806. So you get 200 years compressed in that short period of time of where he moved and lived, and his family, and who he was, and all of his, the foundings of the nation of Israel. That was the very beginning, the 12 tribes is who they came from. And so you got a 200-year piece of history there that is, a few books in the Bible, a few pieces in books. So when you're trying to sort these things out in the way the Bible's written, it's like if I was writing a history of Carter County right now, and I said, I grew up on Stony Creek, you'd know where that was, okay? And I'd say, I went to school at ETSU, you'd know where that was. And if I said, well, I moved to Memphis and went to school there, you'd know where that was. That'd just be, but in 200 years, or 300 years, or 400, or even 50 years, those places may not exist under that name anymore. Those things disappear. And we know, for instance, with the geography that's involved, a lot of the cities that were on the coast in Asia Minor and Turkey are gone now because of the flooding and the way the rivers filled in. They can no longer have a bay. They can no longer have a seaport. It went away. It disappeared. So when you're looking at the Bible and you're trying to study the Bible, it's written basically at that time, for that time. So it makes it kind of hard to understand. But the empires, the people were there, the folks that occurred, for instance, the Roman Empire, we know about it. But there were other empires that occurred prior to that time, and they lasted for hundreds of years, and some of them 1,000 years. And here we are in our country for a few hundred years. So thinking about the changes, so the geography of that part of the world, it hasn't changed a whole lot. It's changed some. The Eastern Mediterranean was been an area of development and people living there for, we know, over 4,000 years. That's a long time. Okay? Because the pyramids, like I said, were built, we think some of the early pyramids roughly in 2,650 BC. So there were people there before that, because that's when they first started the industry. So that part of the world has been settled for a very long time. And what they would do is they'd build on top of other places. And so when you look at the area of Israel, you look at that particular area, you'll see choke points where they've got a place that was a battlement. Well, that was built on a battlement that was there before, and before that, and before that. So they start digging down through these things, and they start finding all these evidence of these other civilizations. So most of the civilizations that occurred prior to now were actually city-states, like the Greeks. And a perfect example, and I'll get to a little bit more about it in a minute, is Nineveh. We all know about Nineveh, okay? And Jonah went to Nineveh to tell them they were doing the wrong thing, and he didn't want to go. But he ended up going, and they changed the way they did things, and God spared them. Well, Nineveh became the Assyrian Empire. That's where they came from. So when you look at that part of the world in geography, Nineveh was over the mountain in the plain of the Tigris and Euphrates. You have the coastal plain, you have the hills, you have the mountains and the desert, and on the other side of the mountain, the desert, you have the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So that's considered the cradle of civilization. They said Africa, but actually it's probably that's where everything started. They think that may have been where the Garden of Eden was. Okay? So you have this area then has been lived in for a very long time. And what has always happened, all you got to do is go to the book of Kings and read Kings, and you will be so confused about who was what and where, and who was fighting who, and who was killing who, and who was in charge and who wasn't in charge. And then you go back to Judges and look at that, and you get even more confused. So when we're looking at these things, you can spend a great deal of time studying. For instance, after the death of Joseph, we know what happened then. You had the birth of Moses, you had the Exodus, you had Joshua was appointed the leader, you had the crossing of the Jordan, and then you had the conquest of Canaan. The conquest of Canaan occurred in roughly 1407 to 1382 BC. So around 1400 years prior to Christ's birth. So that was the founding, the beginning of the actual kingdom, nation of Hebrews, of the Jews. That was it. That's when they moved in there and set up housekeeping in that area. And of course, when they did that, remember all the difficulties they had. They had to deal with the Philistines and all the other people that lived there in Canaan. Well, when you go to that and read that, you'll see a list of about half a dozen different groups of people that they trace their roots back to Adam, to his kids. And so these were people that traced it back that far, and you start looking at who they were. So that area then was settled already, people living there, and the Hebrews came in and took it over. So we have had culture clashes from the very earliest times. Now, so they're there. They've got they're set up. That's the period of the judges. The periods of the judges is roughly from 1376 to 1035 BC. So you've got roughly, we'll call it 600 years, something like that, of the judges being there. So you got 600 years of history in the book of Judges. Okay? So like I said, you want to run pay attention to the judges and spend some time studying that before we get to Kings. That's 600 years that you have the nation of Hebrews being controlled by judges for 600 years. So when they talk about these different people they had clashes with and difficulties and problems, and part of the reason was because when God sent them into Canaan, he told them to kill everybody. Well, they didn't. So as a result, you had these other groups of people that rose up to power. Well, during that time is when the Hittites were around. That was the time that the Hittite Empire came to power. And their empire was from the southern part of Asia Minor, which is Turkey today, down into Palestine, down into where the Hebrews are, and extended over to the Tigris and Euphrates River. They were extraordinarily violent people, and they were giving the Hebrews a rough time. And if you'll look at some historical records, you'll see that in northern Israel, they had a lot of outposts and forts and stuff that they were fighting to try to keep the Hittites from invading them. But at the same time, they had alliances with Hittites from time to time to fight other tribes, other peoples in that area. So you have almost a continuous time of war during the time of Judges. Okay? So they were fighting and fighting. And so the Jewish folks wanted a king like everybody else, mainly because they could defend themselves. Because you got the king in charge. He puts together the army, puts together all the things that are involved with that. And they wanted their own king because all these other little places around them were giving a hard time. The Hittites had their own kings. As a matter of fact, there were 3 of them. And they wanted to defend themselves. So you have this clash of culture again. And that is the beginning of the Kings period. That was from 1031 to 931. That's the United Kingdom time. That's the time from Saul to the time through Solomon. Okay? So you're looking again at over 100 years plus of the nation coming to preeminence. Solomon, of course, built the temple. wouldn't let David. David was actually, Saul did okay, but David actually was the warrior king, and he defeated all the peoples around him. He essentially pushed the Hittites back out of the area, essentially defeated the Philistines. Now, the Philistines lived along the coast. They were the ones that had all the wheat and the barley, and they had a huge commerce. They had a deal with Tyre, which is what we think of as the Phoenicians. And Tyre were worshipers of Baal. And they took their religion throughout the entire part of the Mediterranean. So you had their religion as far as North Africa in that area, Ethiopia, all the way around to Libya, what would be Libya, those areas, and along the coast of Italy, all the way to Spain. So the Tyre folks were Phoenicians. They were traders, and wherever they went, they were the ones that developed a trading system involved with math. Okay? And so they were the ones that traded in that entire Mediterranean area. Well, what happened was Solomon said, well, they're doing a good job, but we can do better. So the king of Tyre said, well, I'll just turn it all over to you. So Solomon built his own kind of navy, but at the same time took over Tyre. And the Tyrees, they were Phoenicians, they were pretty smart. So they didn't fight a lot of people. They would make treaties with them. They would actually let them, because they were traders. And so but they still clung to their religion. So you have the Jewish single God competing with Baal. And that was a big mistake. And so what happened was Solomon, of course, got more and more wealthy, had all kinds of wives and concubines, and you know the whole story. We can read the whole thing if you want to. But he was the one that created the huge kingdom of Israel, the whole area. The temple did all that stuff. So that's when the Hebrews came to be a mighty empire. And it's because through treaties, through battles, and so they had suppressed the Hittites. They took over the Phoenicians. They suppressed the Egyptians. The Egyptians didn't want anything to do with them. And at that time, just over the mountain, over in the Tigris-Euphrates area, there was an early Babylonian kingdom developing, empire developing in Babylon. So Babylon's been there a very long time. And it was developing. And they were competing with Nineveh. Nineveh then was to become Assyria, the Assyrians. So now we have the one kingdom has been united. It was at that time it was said that the gold in the temple, it was all the known gold in the world at that time was in the temple. Now, don't think it was, but that's what the comments have been made. So there's so much gold in the temple that of course would be a huge prize to anyone thinking about this, so this was known about. This is not secret. This is not hidden. So the Hebrew Empire was not a hidden thing. It was Solomon's time to put this together. And then, of course, what happened was Solomon dies, and what occurs? Well, then you got problems. You ended up with two kingdoms. You end up with the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. It's the divided kingdom. And you've got different kings and different leaders in different areas. And the northern kingdom broke away. That is the basis of the Sumerians. That's who the Sumerians are, is the northern kingdom of Israel. And so the Jews didn't like the Sumerians, although they were brothers and sisters. And they set up their own temple in Samaria, but they were still Hebrews. Now you've heard about the Sumerians, all the things like that. That's who they were. They were actually Hebrews. But you remember in the New Testament, the Sumerian woman at the well, this kind of stuff. They didn't talk to each other because they split off and had their own temple in Samaria, and that's the northern kingdom. Well, they were misbehaving. The northern kingdom had a deal with Tyre. Okay, they actually got the trade, the things going with them. And to get along the coast of the Mediterranean and to get over around the mountains and get down into the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, you had to go through through the country of Israel, northern Israel, to get there. So they're geographically, they were set on the trade route, major trade route. So if you wanted to go from Egypt, you wanted to trade the wheat and things in Egypt, on the delta, on the plains in Egypt, and you wanted to trade for something that they had over in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, or you wanted to trade for something up in Asia Minor, you had to go through Israel, which was in the northern kingdom. So they were set and doing pretty well, but they were worshiping Baal and all the idols. They actually went completely away from God and started worshiping all the idols, because that's what happens when they got too big for their britches. They were doing things like that, and they were being totally different from what God set up. So what happens? Well, Nineveh, the period of time of Nineveh, that was the time of Jonah. Jonah and Hosea were contemporaries. This is the roughly 782 to 725 BC. So God is told he don't like the way things are going in Israel. So what does he do? He says, go over to Nineveh and tell them to straighten out. And they did. So he allowed Nineveh then to become the Assyrian Empire, which in turn came around and punished Israel. They captured and destroyed Israel. This is roughly 722 BC. So during that time, when Jonah talked to Nineveh, and Nineveh repented, he let them go. They defeated the Hittites, put them completely down, and then came around and attacked Israel, which was the northern part, and took them into captivity. But he didn't let them capture Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the capital of Judah, which is the southern kingdom, and they were put under siege. And then you can read about it in Kings, and you can read about it in that period of time. But he let Jerusalem survive, let Judah survive, but he let the northern kingdom become under captivity. Now that was in, like I said, 722 BC. So that's gone. Samaria is gone now. It's been taken over by the Assyrians. And what do the Assyrians do? Well, they go back to the same old thing they used to do. They became idol worshipers. They didn't go with God. They did the things that they weren't supposed to do. And they actually basically destroyed northern Israel and everything around them. God wasn't happy with that, apparently. And then because other things happened. Now, I need to make a short comment. Rome was founded roughly at 753 AD. So Rome is just beginning to develop during this period of time, just starting with the Assyrian Empire. But they don't have anything to do with anybody else. They're way over in the other part of the Mediterranean. They're developing Italy, that area. They've got trade all the way up into Europe. They've got trade along the Balkans. So Rome is just starting out. Now, so this is 700 years before Christ. So Rome is not a new place, but it's new here. Okay? So now the Assyrians are showing off what they do. They take over that part. Well, what happens? Well, God decided, and Israel and Judah is misbehaving. So then the Babylon Empire actually comes to power. Babylon, city-state, develops. It's not Nebuchadnezzar, it's his father who develops the kingdom and actually starts defeating the Assyrians. Now that's in the southern part of the Tigris and Euphrates Valley. Okay, the Assyrians are in the northern parts where Nineveh is. And so Babylon then comes to power and marches up to Nineveh and destroys it. takes it over. But God allows them to do that. And then they come around and take out the rest of the Assyrian Empire. So they march north, come across the northern part, and come into that trade area that I was talking about, down into Israel. And now they come to Judah. They come to Jerusalem. And so he comes to lay siege to Jerusalem. Well, what happens there? Well, that is roughly 587 A.D. and 586 A.D. He lets them give up, leaves them with a leader, a king, somebody that's kind of halfway in charge during this period of time. These are the time of the prophets of Amos and Micah, Isaiah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, and then Jeremiah is 627 to 560 A.D. So during this period of time, prior to them taking out Jerusalem, you've got all these prophets telling them, you better straighten up. Things aren't going to go well. You need to behave yourself. You need to go back to God. The whole time, the Babylonians are making their empire bigger and bigger and coming down, taking care of the Assyrians, all these battles. And he's also fighting the Egyptians at the same time. So God tells them, you need to give in to the Babylonians and let them take over. Well, they don't want to do that. Their king doesn't want to do that. So he makes a treaty with the Egyptians. And this is roughly 630 or 640 BC. But God told them not to do that. Okay? So instead of doing what God told them to do, what the prophets told them what they're supposed to do, they make the plan with the Egyptians. Well, what happens is a huge, huge battle. The Egyptians and the Hebrews, remember, the Hebrews were a real formidable fighting force. They had been tremendous, but they've gone downhill. So the Babylonians defeat them. So now the Babylonians have decided, well, I was nice to you, and we let Jerusalem stand. And we sent, we're supposed to pay tribute, you're supposed to behave yourself, you're supposed to do what you're supposed to do. And they didn't. You made this friendship with Egypt. And if you'll read, there's a couple of the prophets that went off were actually kidnapped and taken to Egypt. And so what happens then is he comes in and destroys Jerusalem. Okay, the first time he came, he carried off a bunch of folks from Jerusalem, carried off a lot of money, wanted tribute, did not destroy the temple. Carried a lot of stuff out of the temple, but didn't destroy it. Remember, the temple's full of gold. So he took a lot of stuff off. Well, when he came back the second time, he destroyed it. They tore it down, took all the gold, took all the cedar, took all the valuable stuff, all the things that they had, took the best and brightest out of Jerusalem. That's when Daniel went with Nebuchadnezzar. That's where Daniel ended up. And this was 70 years. Well, remember, during that time that Nebuchadnezzar took it over, Daniel did all these prophecies, and Nebuchadnezzar went nuts. God had him behaving like an animal out in the fields, eating grass and all that kind of stuff. And then he come to himself. God let him come to himself, and he took back over again. Well, of course, that failed. And now that was the Babylonian Empire was captured and destroyed by Cyrus, who was a Persian, in 539 BC. So 587 to 586 BC was captivity of Judah. The Babylonians then were in power for roughly 50, 60 years, supposed to have been 70 years. And then they didn't do what he told them to do. So we had Cyrus and the Persian Empire come in. Now the Persian Empire was 539 to 331 BC. So this was when they allowed the Jews to come back to Jerusalem. The Jews returned in 536. The temple was rededicated in 516. 458, Ezra led the caravan of Jews back. And then 445, Nehemiah returns to Jerusalem again to repair the city walls. So you have a period of time here, from 536 to 445. So you have almost 100 years of living in Jerusalem or living in Judah and not building the city back. So when you read that and you read all this stuff and you read it in Daniel and you read it in Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, when you read all these things and you read these circumstances, it's compressed. It was 100 years that they came back and started rebuilding. So now the Persian Empire let them come back, and Cyrus, who was persuaded by Daniel to do these things, he protected them during that time. Now he was replaced by a couple of guys named Xerxes. Now Xerxes was not a good guy. Okay, Xerxes considered himself a god, and he captured the Persian Empire. Then took that whole area and moved all the way around the northern part of the Mediterranean, all the way up into Asia Minor, all that, and then he was the one that went after the Greeks. Now the Roman Empire hasn't started yet; they're still just developing in Rome. The Greeks have their own empire at this time, and they're the ones. And you've heard of Thermopylae, you've heard of the 300 that fought there, and the Spartans and the Athenians, all that stuff. I'm not going to get into that. That's who clashed with the Persians at that time. And Persia is modern day Iran. Okay, that's, if you're wondering where that's at, that's Persia. And so when you talk to people from Iran, they don't like to be considered Arabs. They're Persians. And they're descendants of the Persian Empire. So Xerxes had huge armies, and what he would do is he'd move into an area and take it over and make people swear allegiance to him, and created these huge armies. But they were stopped in Greece. And while they were going on, they left, while there was all this is going on, they left the Hebrews alone. Okay, so there's a period then of roughly 400 years from the time, the interval between the Testaments, they calls it. That's in the time of the Maccabees and those guys. That's when the Roman Empire developed. That 400-year period of time. And of course, you've got Alexander the Great in the process there too. I'm not going to dive into that. So you have the rise and the fall of all these different empires and kingdoms. And most of them did okay for a while because they followed God's regulations and rules. And then when they didn't, they collapsed. And so he used different empires. He used the Assyrian Empire to punish the Hebrews. Then he used the Babylonian Empire to punish the Hebrews. And then he let the Persians come in and let them rebuild. And what are we seeing today? Okay, and we'll jump into that for a minute. We know that that the Jews were, after the Romans came in, destroyed the temple in roughly 60 A.D., the Jews were dispersed throughout the world. It was the end of the Hebrew state. It was the end of it. And then after World War II, after it was the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in World War I, and then in World War II, it was the Ottomans and the Germans, and those folks were controlling that area. And the British defeated them in World War I and took it over. So from the time of World War I to World War II, that area was controlled by the Brits. And what they did is they divided that entire Middle Eastern area up into different places. So all the places we think of today, Iraq, Iran, Jordan, Syria, all these places in there were artificially made by the Brits. Okay, Palestine, which was basically Jerusalem, the old Israel and Judea, became Palestine because they made a deal with the Arabs to defeat the Ottoman Empire in World War I. Okay, and so when the time after World War I, the Brits were the ones that controlled the entire area and put it into different places. They made agreement, and these were all made up by the different tribes. There were different folks in those tribes, and they made that up. So what happened then Well, it's after World War II, when the Brits were trying to figure out what to do with this place. They didn't want anything to do with it. He couldn't manage them. And then he stepped away, and that's when you had the beginning of all the Middle Eastern problems with the different tribes and the Muslims and the different types of Muslims. And then that's when Israel decided after World War II, it's when the Jews decided to have their own state, to go back to that area that they were in. And they made an agreement they were trying to make an agreement with the Palestinians, who were Arabs, primarily Arabs, and primarily Muslim, although there are Christian Arabs, Palestinians. And they made agreements with them to fight the Brits and establish a state. And of course that fell apart. And then you have the birth of the new kingdom, or the new country of Israel. So that's how we got to Israel. That's how it happened. So that entire area, all these countries we're talking about, Iraq, Iran, Jordan, Syria, all these kind of places, were just a result of coalescing of certain tribes. The only thing that united them was the fact that they were Muslim. And inside the Muslims, you have the Sunnis and the Shia who hate each other. So you have all one kind would move to one place, another place. And the other common denominator between all these Arabs is they hate the Palestinians. That's why none of them would take the Palestinians in when they've had all this problem. They would not let any of the Palestinians. They'd let some of them settle in Jordan, out in the middle of the desert where there's nothing out there. They let them, but they wouldn't let them go in. The Iranians wouldn't take them. The Iraqis wouldn't take them. The Egyptians absolutely will not take them. And so that's been a big problem, is that the Palestinians then have been put into these small areas, and because nobody likes them. Okay, so that's how we got to today. So I hope I didn't put too many of you to sleep. I'm sorry. But the history of the Old Testament is fascinating. And they're discovering more and more of these places that the Bible mentioned. They're discovering all these places. And so, but we've compressed 2,000 years of history in a short period of time. And then of course, we do know more about the Romans and those kind of guys, because there's more information. But that's how we ended up. That's how we ended up with the loss of the Hebrew Empire, the Hebrews, the Israelis, and how we have a new Hebrew nation. That's how we got to today. And that's the history. Now that's a really short, compact, historical information. And I'd encourage you to go read Judges, read Kings. It is confusing. Yes, it is. But it helps if you've got a concordance to look things up in, to go things. I use a lot of Bible research things like that. You can go on the internet and look stuff up to keep it straight in your head of who is what, where, and when, which is hard, okay? Especially when you're trying to pronounce some of these names. So it's strange. Any questions about that? I know that's a lot to take in. But when he was talking about the prophets, and he was talking about who was saying what, when, and where they were, all these prophets were involved in trying to change the Judeans, actually, from who they were, going back to normal, and they didn't. And that's why they ended up getting in captivity. And then you had that 100 years of trying to get back to normal. And then, of course, their misbehavior during the Roman period of time got them in trouble. And so they were always, the whole time now, they're looking for the Messiah.
All this points to why we had to have Jesus.
Yeah. The whole time they're looking for Jesus. And the whole time they're not looking for the kind of Jesus that they got. They're looking for another King David to bring their kingdom, their nation back to an empire. That's what they've been looking for the last 2,000 years. To go back to the power and the strength and to the glory of Solomon's empire. And that's what they're looking at. So they've denied Jesus' worldwide empire. So it's different. All right, any questions about that? I know that your head's spinning around, and hope I'm not giving you too much of a headache and these kind of things. But it's fascinating if you spend a little time studying. How did we get here? How did we get in this mess? Well, nobody over there likes anybody else. And it's been that way for centuries, for 4,000 years. They've hated each other. And they're all related. Okay? They're all in the same family. When you start tracing the names back. Okay? It's worse than the McCoys and the Hatfields. Okay. All right.
So did the British divide them up like that to make them thinking they would be easier to control, whereas if they, not control, but to rule, whereas if he left them all alone in one big pot, would they have gotten along better?
Well, before World War I, when the Ottoman Empire took over, they were in charge. They actually had them all under control because it's real easy. If you stick your head up, they cut it off. So the Ottoman Empire controlled this entire thing, World War I. And then the Brits, once they defeated the Ottoman Empire, had to do something with these folks. And they didn't know what to do with them because you have all these different tribes. And each one of the tribes had their leader. And the only thing they had in common was they were Muslim, and that was it. And so what they tried to do was break it up into what tribe lived where. That's what they tried to do. Because there's huge expanses of desert out there that nobody lives in. And they get the Bedouins who travel back and forth, and they had to decide, well, which country they're going to be in. They didn't want to be in any country. And if you'll look at a map of the Middle East now, if you look at that map and you look at the things, you'll see some odd. It looks like gerrymandering that they've done up in Illinois, and you get the place over here and a place over there, and that's why they try to group them up into related tribes, mainly based on their religious background, the Sunnis and the Shia. Okay, but Saudi Arabia is still a kingdom. Jordan is still a kingdom. Okay? And Iran was a kingdom. Remember, the Shah of Iran was a kingdom. So they all had kings. So some of them got kings, but they all had kings. So that's the remnants of what we're talking about here. They had kings. So the Saudis still have the royal family and the kings. But the Iran was that way until Jimmy Carter messed up. Okay, but they've been, Iran and Iraq fought wars for I don't know how many, 30 years or something like that. World War I type stuff with trenches and things like that. They fought each other forever. They hated each other. But when Saddam Hussein took control, they actually had a king in Iraq, and they deposed him. There's still a royal family from Iraq of some kind, but they don't exist anymore. And Iran was Persia, and they had their royal family, but that all went away with the mullahs. So those kingdoms have been fighting each other for a long time. But you still have kingdoms over there. You still have royal families. It's just totally different. So I know it is real confusing. And very frankly, I don't know which side to support. I have no idea who they are. Any other questions? That's a good question. Get a chance to look at a map of the Middle East. You'll see what I'm talking about. It's really confusing. So you can imagine what it must have been like when you had all these different groups and all these people who were fighting each other, and this one's invading that one, and this one's attacking this one and that one. And it's culture wars like you wouldn't believe. So to even consider that the kind of peace we have right now is remarkable, it is remarkable. The fact that this country is held together as long as it has is remarkable. People are not like that. Okay. Any other questions? Bobby, would you dismiss us, please?
Father,